What's your story? Sociologists say that we have a framing narrative, a construction of the world, a story that helps us make sense of what's going on and points us to peace and prosperity. We tell all kinds of stories, and if you look in our news, you'll see all kinds of stories about what it is to be successful and what it means to be right. But there's a different story. The Jesus story. It's a different kingdom with a different set of values and a different way of being human. What does that story look like? As Jesus teaches about his values, about his kingdom, how does that come up against our other empire stories? And let's explore what the Jesus story means for you and what the Jesus story means for living in the kingdom now and for eternity. There's a different story. It's the Jesus story, and you're invited to be part of it. Everywhere we look, people are telling all kinds of stories. Stories about what it is to be successful, stories about what it is to be in control, stories about peace and security and safety. We tell these stories. It's what sociologists call our framing narrative, our way of making sense of this world, our way of talking about peace and prosperity, and we tell stories. Everywhere you look, you find these stories coming at you. What's your story? What has shaped your story? And what story do you tell of what it is to have peace and prosperity in this world? Today we're going to explore the dominating stories. But amongst all that, we explore an even more important story. Reality is, every empire has a story. Mark Griffiths, he wrote the book One Generation from Extinction, but Mark Griffiths explains how every empire has a framing narrative. Every empire has a story that describes what it is to be successful, what it is to have peace and prosperity. He says that every empire throughout history has a framing story. More significantly, it's not just empires that have a story. You and I have a story. We have a story about what it is to be human. You and I live in those stories, and our workplaces have stories. But Mark Griffiths says there's basically 5 different stories or combinations of stories that we tell ourselves. The most common, or the one we see expressed most often, is domination. In this story, I tell you that if you do what I say, then we'll have peace and prosperity. I will use my control. I will use my force. If you don't do what I say, I'll make you do what I say. Empires throughout history have used this story to control people, and the domination story is lived out in all kinds of different contexts. It's about me. It's about this empire, and we will control through finances or force or whatever else we have at our disposal, we'll control to make you do what I want or what we want. Do we ever see this lived out in empires on the planet at the moment? Do we ever see empires that say, do it this way or we'll make you? Does this story ever get lived out in workplaces? Do it my way or I'll make you? Does it ever get lived out in marriages? Do it my way or I'll make you, the domination story. If you just did it my way, we'd be happy. Just do it as I want, and you use whatever power and control is at your disposal to make someone do that. The domination story is a dangerous story, but it's been played out in human culture over generations. The next story, revenge. This is played by those people who are sick of the domination story. Let's get rid of that group. Let's get down with them, and we'd be happy, we'd be prosperous, we'd be successful if we didn't have those people dominating. Let's get revenge on them and let's overthrow them. And life gets consumed by this revenge. Everything is looked at through the grid of revenge. And if you look around our planet, you can see countries where generation after generation have played out domination, revenge, and it just goes on. Even if we've forgotten what we started fighting for, we know that that person over there is the enemy, that group is the enemy, and if we could just get rid of them, then we'd be fine. And so it's a revenge story that consumes. But does it get played out in workplaces? Does it get played out in families? Does it ever get played out in churches where there's domination and revenge? And we might dress it up theologically, or we might dress it up in other ways, but it's still simply at the very core, domination and revenge. As we look around our planet, we see this story lived out way too often, and people's lives getting destroyed because of it. As there's domination and revenge, and we'll get you back because you did this, we'll get you back because you did that. And the story repeats in cycles over and over again. Next story is purification. This is probably an even more dangerous story. Why? Because in this story, when revenge gets to be in charge, and let's say I am now in charge and things haven't worked out like I said they would, when I'm now in charge and we haven't got the peace and prosperity I said you were going to get, then we play out an even more dangerous story. In this story, it's them, it's those people over there. They're the reason why we've got to get rid of them. It's that group of people who are doing life this way. That's the reason why we haven't got the utopia I told you were going to get. And empires throughout history have played this story with incredibly tragic consequences. Empires throughout history, it's that group, it's these people, it's those kind of people, it's this group. That's who we've got to get rid of. And we dehumanize them, we turn them into something else. If they were gone, then we'd be fine. And sadly, there's story after story in our history of groups choosing that's the outsiders and we're the insiders and we're the us and that's the them. And we make that them less than, and somehow we make them less than human, and somehow we justify all kinds of atrocities. And you can see it in Nazi Germany. You can see it in all kinds of stories where it's them and we'll get rid of them and then we'll be okay. Do we ever play it out in other ways? Surely that doesn't get played out in churches. Well, maybe church is far away, but sometimes we can also go, it's that group who think this, or it's that group who have that idea. That's the group that are causing the trouble. If we didn't have them, we'd be better off. And it's a dangerous story because lives get cost because of it. Next story. Isolation story. It's a story that empires play out where we're going to separate ourselves from and we're going to do things our way. And we're going to separate ourselves from all these other empires, and we will only read the things that we write, and we'll only sing the songs that we put together, and we'll only tell the stories to each other, and we'll isolate ourselves from everyone else. Any examples come to mind? You might be thinking North Korea. We'll put the boundaries up and no one goes out and no one comes in, and we'll control what you read and what you hear, and we'll do life in our bubble. It's the isolation story. It's a story that for a moment might sound good, but we promise the peace and prosperity if we do it our way and you listen to me and just do what I tell you in the bubble. The fifth story is the consumer accumulation story. In this story, all of it is for me. We talked about this in episode 5, where it's all for me. In accumulation story, all this stuff is for me and I will store up, or as an empire, we will store up. And we define ourselves by how much we have. And peace and prosperity is dependent upon putting ourselves first and everyone else bad luck to you. It's the accumulation story. It's this must be for me. And sure, we can use that for power and control, or sure, we'll use that for leverage, but basically it's for me. Reality is, at any time, empires throughout history have used one or sometimes more of these stories to justify their existence, to give their meaning of prosperity and hope. They have used these stories to say, this is what it is to have peace and prosperity and do it this way. Domination, revenge, purification, isolation, accumulation. It's the stories we live in. And as Mark Griffiths points out, it's been going on for generations. We can say humans are different, but humans have this same propensity to live out the same stories. Whether it's an empire, closer to home, whether it's in your workplace, the domination story, do it this way, otherwise I'll use force. The revenge story, blame them. Or what about in families? Domination, revenge, purification, isolation. And what about in churches, where we dress up these stories to look like a Jesus story? And sadly, over and over, we've seen empires do horrendous things to people and dress it up theologically. Sometimes we'll put God on our side and we'll make God agree with the very things that I agree with, and we make God small to make ourselves big, and God ends up being the projection we put onto him, and then we live out domination and revenge and purification, isolation and accumulation. And we might dress it up as theology, we might dress it up as a Jesus story, but underneath it all, it's still just simply the human propensity for domination, revenge, purification, isolation and accumulation. Just dressed up as a Jesus story. So, let's take a step back. If these stories have been lived out over and over and over, if these stories are the stories that humans keep expressing, what about when Jesus was on this planet? Did he come across these stories? What was the domination story when Jesus was on the planet? It was the Romans. The Romans were the empire. The Romans were the ones saying, this is what it means to be part of this empire, and we'll take your money, and it's about domination and control. Here's the thing. How does Jesus say to treat the Roman Empire? What does Jesus say about domination? First of all, Jesus says, in my kingdom, domination is not the story. In my kingdom, nothing good is gained by force. In my kingdom, it's not a thing that uses power and control. In my kingdom, the meek inherit. In my kingdom, the first shall be last. You don't dominate so well when the first is last. In my kingdom, the greatest amongst you is a servant. You don't dominate so well when you come with a posture of service rather than control. In my kingdom, it's not about domination and force, it's about service. It's about humility. It's about meekness. Jesus says that's when you're truly great. We might look at it and count it as weakness. In the domination story, it doesn't make sense. In the face of domination, the Jesus story seems upside down. But Jesus says true strength is found in humility. What about the revenge story? Who were the people after revenge was Jesus on the planet? You read about them in Matthew, the Zealots. The Zealots were down with the Romans. They were intent on getting back at these Romans. What's Jesus' advice to the revenge story? If your enemy takes your shirt, give him your coat. If your enemy makes you carry the load 1 mile, carry it 2. Pray for those who spitefully use you. That's a really weird way of getting revenge. In the Jesus story, it's not about revenge. It's about turning the other cheek. It's about going the extra mile. Love your enemies. And as Jesus says, it's easy to love those people who agree with you. But what about loving the person who's your enemy? What about love for the person you like the least? That's an incredibly radical way of being human and an incredibly radical story. Love your enemy, do good to those who spitefully use you. Imagine if that got played out on empire scales, and imagine if there was one country fighting against another country, and that's our enemy. Therefore, we're going to go and build them swimming pools and schools, and we're going to go in and make libraries and parks, and we're going to do good for them, and we're going to carry an extra mile. It sounds crazy, but this is a different way of being human. It's a different story. What about the purification story? Who was living out that story? The Pharisees. The Pharisees, it's them. They're the problem. Those Sadducees, even if their shadow falls on you, you're unclean. We've got it right. The Pharisees were the ones who probably looked the most like Jesus, but Jesus says, hey, these outsiders who you call the outsiders are actually the insiders, and they're coming into the kingdom ahead of you. Because you've forgotten what really matters, and you might be doing all this and getting that tithing right, and you might be getting all those rules, but you've forgotten the weightier matters of justice and mercy. And you're getting in the way of my kids coming to the kingdom. And Jesus says, I would rather you have a millstone around your neck and throw into the ocean than get in the way of my kids. And this woman who's sitting at a well, who's had multiple husbands and now with someone who's not her husband, that's my kid. She's not unclean. And you ask me, who is your neighbor? Well, are you being a neighbor? Because that Samaritan who you look down your nose at, he's being the neighbor. All these kids are my kids as Jesus take, and some of us are called to serve all of us. And don't you dare count those ones out. Because in Jesus' take, we're called to serve everybody, not just the ones we like or who we're comfortable with. Jesus calls us to live a life of usness. And in stories of purification, in stories where we want to count that group out, what's it look like to serve the least of these or serve the people you like the least? Because in Jesus' kingdom, there's a different story, there's a different grid, there's a different system, there's a different thing going on. What about isolation? Who was living out the isolation story in Jesus' time? The Essenes. The Essenes were, let's get away from everybody else, let's make our own community, let's do our own thing, and let's not be contaminated by those people out there. Let's not be contaminated by the world. We'll do our own stuff and we'll make our own little group doing our own little thing. Sounds beautiful, hey? But Jesus says, no. Because you're called to be salt. You're called to be light. You're called to bring your flavor into the world, the flavor of the kingdom. And how do you do that if the salt stays in the salt shaker? How do you do that if the light is hidden? You and I are called to be part of this world and bring Jesus' story to this world, to be people who are Jesus' hands and feet, to live out this different story. It might sound nice to live in this little commune and do our own thing in our little bubble and only do what works for us. But if that's at the expense of other, then we've missed the point. The Jesus kingdom is not some little culture and society spinning its own little wheels. The Jesus kingdom is this yeast and is this light and is this salt and is this seed that grows and grows, and it works through you and me as we represent Jesus in our world. The accumulation story, Jesus meets a rich young ruler. And this rich young ruler says, look at all the things I have. What else do I need to be saved? For him, his riches were a symbol of God's blessing. I must be doing great because I have all this stuff. What does Jesus say? Sell your stuff and give it to the poor. And it says the man walked away sad. Why? Because he defined himself by his stuff. Jesus still asks you and I the same question. Am I enough for you? If you didn't have all this stuff, if you hadn't accumulated all you have, would following me, if it was just you and me, would I be enough for you? See, here's the thing. Amongst all these stories, there's a different story going on. Open up a newspaper, get a news feed on your phone, and look at story after story of domination, revenge, purification, isolation, accumulation. You look at all that and you'll see it everywhere once you start looking for these stories. But then there's a still small voice. Then there's the kingdom story, the Jesus story. A story of serving, a story of generosity, a story of looking after the least of these, a story of justice and mercy. It's a different way of being human. It grows and serves and connects and shares and worships. It lives life to a different grid. You might get all these other stories dressed up as Jesus stories, but if they're domination, revenge, purification, isolation, accumulation, even if they dress themselves up as Jesus stories, it's a sham. Now, the thing is, this isn't just a political philosophy, as good as it might be. It's a new way of being human based on relationship, based on vine and branches, where God is the vine and you're the branch, and you allow him to abide in you, and he works in and through you to live out a different story. It's about people coming together and making faith communities, call them churches, that live out this story, that show the world there's a different way to be human, and that's the revolution. When we practice the one another's of serving and loving one another and sharing with one another and worshiping with one another, when we do that together, that's a different way to be human. It's a different story. But let me tell you, it's the grid that's worth giving your life to for eternity. It's humanity at its best. It's allowing Christ to dwell richly in us, to work in and through us, to live out a different way of being human. It's living out a different story. It's the Jesus story. May you represent, may you be the Jesus story in your life. It starts by connecting with him, allowing him to work in and through you. Let's pray. Lord, as we come to you now, there's all kinds of stories vying for our attention and all kinds of people telling us how to do life. Amongst all this, may we allow you to work in us. May we allow you to work in and through us. May we live out a different way of being human that brings glory to you for now and eternity. Amen.